Good morning, everybody. My name is Kristen Devaney. I'm an attorney with Keith Shapiro and Ford. I've been at that firm for about 5.5 years now. And prior to that, I worked at another matrimonial and family law firm. And I was there from the time that I graduated law school. So this is the field that I have been doing essentially since I've been admitted to the bar. I'm the group's divorce and family law attorney. I help people through uncontested divorces as well as litigious divorces, dealing with issues of custody, child support, maintenance, equitable distribution of the assets, and in family court, orders of protection, custody issues as well for parties who are not married, and child support issues. I also do adoptions. That's not going to be the focus of my presentation today, but I did want to remind people that I do adoptions. I love them, and I'm always looking for more clients in that arena. So what I wanted to talk about today is relating divorce to COVID-19 and how this pandemic is affecting households that are happy households is what I call them. And also how the pandemic has affected or is affecting couples who are in the process of divorcing or thought that they were going down that path prior to this happening, and how the court system has responded to the pandemic. You'll see, but I did a sort of time frame for how the courts have responded. And when you were in the moment, it seems like it was taking forever. And looking back at the specific dates of the gradual reopening, it has actually been astounding. So I wanted to go through that and show you guys. Okay, so how COVID has impacted already happy household dynamics. So a couple things. Running a household can be difficult in the easiest of times, right? Especially if there are kids involved. You're living on Long Island, so most families that I come across have 2-income households, and that is something that is required in order to meet the high cost of living that exists here. Of course, there are some families that are able to exist on one income, but the families that I represent are usually those who have 2 incomes coming in. When there are kids involved and there are 2 working parents, there's always roles that every single person plays, right? And then the pandemic hits, and even in my household, I have witnessed a shift or a birth of knowledge of what the roles are going to be, right? So we've got now homeschooling added to the list. We've got people trying to work from home. We've got maybe somebody is furloughed or has now unemployed, so looking for other employment. And there is a shift in people's roles in what they do in the household. And so prior to the pandemic, sometimes people would do a divide and conquer. You do this, I do this, and then together we've been able to accomplish how the household is run. Or it's shared parental roles. We both do this task, we both do this task, and together 50% of effort into this makes it actually happen and move forward. In the pandemic, some people are able to continue that and still do a divide and conquer type of scenario, or share everything if they're able to do that. And sometimes one-sidedness of roles are kind of exposed. And so, for example, homeschooling is something that was added to the list in a lot of households. Are both parents contributing towards the homeschooling? Is only one person contributing towards the homeschooling? That's something that has caused a lot of strain in cases that I have seen. And even if both parents are contributing towards the homeschooling, perhaps one parent thinks that it's not done well enough, or their expectations are slightly different for what their kids should be doing or presenting, bare minimum versus other types of work to supplement their learning, etc. So it's been a balance of being able to manage your own expectations, how you contribute towards what the kids need to be doing and what you yourself need to be doing and what your spouse needs to be doing in order to maintain their level of income and ability to work. So whether or not it's been successful in households or that has led to a decline, I guess, in the relationship is, I guess, to be seen, but that has definitely been a shift regardless of how you look at it. The financial strain obviously has affected a lot of families. So I think that the primary reason why people seek a divorce typically falls under the heading of some sort of financial stress and inability to handle that stress or climb out of it. And both people think that they have different solutions or mechanisms to climb out of it. And it ends up being that they can't, or there's disagreement about how money is spent, etc. So now we have a pandemic and there's absolutely financial strain on these households, and that can lead to a marital discord, I guess. Another thing that I have seen in my cases that seems silly, but in the moment, it's certainly not. Perspectives on the seriousness of the virus and levels of social distancing can lead to views about the other parent's judgment on how to, I guess, how to raise their kids, or what kids should be exposed to, what they themselves should be exposed to. So, for example, at least in the beginning, kids were still going on play dates. We were still kind of getting together, and some people feared the virus a lot earlier than other people. Some people still don't really listen to the mandates of the lockdown. But I guess the point that I'm making is that when you have kids, two parents' viewpoints as to whether or not they should still be going to work, whether or not their kids should be playing with other children in the playground or at the park or having a picnic. Because remember, in the beginning, they didn't think that the kids were really affected, so people were still getting kids together. And then you've got teenagers in some households that are like, I'm not doing this, I'm going out with my friends, and some parents are more lenient than other parents. Cleaning is also, which sounds really silly, but when we get deliveries, when we get food deliveries, some people are really adamant about making sure everything is wiped down, everything is clean. Other people are like, it's fine, it's no big deal. Cleaning the household is, because we've lost our cleaners. So people that have had the ability to have people come into the house, the pandemic has changed all of that. And that's an additional strain or an additional task that two people need to do. And if it's not on equal footing, sometimes that can cause strain. Okay, what if you were already in the process of going through a divorce, or you were thinking of going through a divorce because there's been some sort of breakdown? The concern has been an increase in domestic violence. When you are quarantined and under lockdown, if there was violence happening in the household, there was certainly an increase in that violence, at least in Nassau County in March, likely because of everyone was cooped up with each other, getting on each other's nerves, and the victim was not able to escape. So domestic violence is something that's been a concern, and that's a field in family law that actually never shut down. So I'll get into that in a few minutes. Effective supervised visitation orders. So imagine that a parent has supervised visitation through an agency appointed by the court. That doesn't happen anymore, it just completely closed. So, and the orders remain in effect, and you can't get a modified order. So what happens is you just can't see your kids for the next however many weeks that it may be that a court continues the order. Personal service issues. This is interesting. So in any litigation, when you file a summons and complaint, you need to do personal service of the complaint in order to have it effective and have it start, essentially. There are other mechanisms. I'm not going to go through all of the different ways of what constitutes personal service, but in the matrimonial field, you want to serve someone by a process server, handing the document to the other party. That would be sufficient notice, and you really need to get permission if you're going to do anything beyond that, or you need to really show due diligence of trying to get that person, etc. Well, a process server is willing to serve. Do I, as an attorney, want to make a process server personally serve somebody with a document and getting into that space? So that has been challenging. Sale of a marital asset. Obviously, I have a couple cases actually where the parties want to sell their house. Amicable, two cases. One, we were not in court yet, and one, we have been in court, and they need to sell the house. They're both on the same page with that, but now we've got a pandemic happening, and is it the right time to sell the house? But then you've got to continue paying the mortgage. So do we just sell it and it is what it is? Or, and plus everything is put on hold, right? As Linda has said. Dissipation of the retirement, right? So because of market influxes, retirement accounts may have declined. And do people wait to see if it bounces back up? Do we just split it as it is? That has been issues for some people. The most interesting and probably most prevalent is the movement of kids between households. So if the parties are already separated, how do we handle the kids being transported from one to the other household when one party doesn't know what the other party is doing? If one party is an essential worker and going into work as a nurse or a doctor or bus driver, how do we handle that? If there are multiple children in multiple households, then it gets dicey too, because you just don't know what every single person is doing. And so there's been concern relayed from a lot of custodial parents that they want to withhold, and I'll get into this a little bit more, but they want to withhold access because of assumptions or knowledge of what the other person is doing, or if there's multiple kids in other households and all coming together in the non-custodial parent's house, etc. And then, of course, there's been frustration on my client's end on how the courts define their cases. So you'll see in the next couple of slides, the court has basically defined certain cases as essential, priority, non-essential, pending, and now we're moving into the non-essential and being able to commence new cases. And there's clients every client thinks their case is essential, right? But that's not how the court is actually defining their particular case. So there's frustration on their ends that their case was basically halted until we can open up again. So this is what I was talking about in the beginning about an interesting time frame. So I remember in the moment thinking this is not going to end and we're just sitting here twiddling our thumbs. We can't get a court date. I can't get a conference. And even opposing counsel, I can't get a hold of opposing counsel, like things aren't moving. And so I went back in time and looked at the specific dates of when things started to shut down and close down and then reopen again. And it was actually astounding. So and kudos to the courts for jumping on this and making it happen. So March 16th, basically everything stops. Adjournments are happening left and right, 30 to 45 days out. You're not going to get a date. If you have a trial, if you have a conference, if you have an emergency, it looks like everything is just put to a halt. The very next day, the governor issued an order tolling all statute of limitations. So filing deadlines for motions. There can be no default judgments. Again, we are shutting down. March 19th, so 2 days later, we're able to email family court petitions and motions. Now they may sit there because nobody's in there to process them, but we're able to actually email it to somebody. In family court, you could never do that. You had to physically show up. 3 days later, we cannot file any new actions. Then March 26th, so that is 10 days from the initial, everything's getting adjourned. 10 days later, virtual appearances can be requested. I mean, that is amazing. 10 days. And they had Skype for Business up and running for most judges, not all of the judges. And we as attorneys were able to request virtual appearances. Now, of course, not for every case. We couldn't request it, just the essential ones. But I think that is pretty amazing. I was talking to a friend of mine in DC. We went to law school together. She practices in Washington, DC, and they're still not even close to having any sort of virtual court appearances, which is a little concerning. But she's in the domestic violence type of work, and they're still not even up and running. So I just think it's amazing what the court system has done here. And what the court has done, like I said, is identify the cases in order, essentially, of what they need to hear. So we've got essential and emergent cases, non-essential priority cases, non-essential pending cases, and then commencing new actions, which the phase we just entered today. And if you look at the dates that I put in here, it's basically around 10 days to 2 weeks for every additional step of reopening or reallowing us to do the next step, which again, I think is phenomenal. In the moment, it felt like it was taking forever, but looking back, it really is quite impressive. E-filing is now a mandate. We can't go in and physically file anything unless you're pro se. Then they make exceptions of being able to do that. If a case is not an e-file case, you can make it an e-file case by doing a stipulation and all of that. But basically, everything is moving towards e-filing. And in other litigation, it was already there. In the matrimonial field, we were headed there in the last year or so, but everything was pretty much voluntary, and you didn't have to do the e-filing if you didn't want to. So now we're going to have to. There were also a ton of town halls, webinars, and memorandums that were going out every 2 to 3 days, and I found that really impressive as well. The difficulty has been the huge variation by county. So obviously I practice mostly in Nassau and Suffolk, but New York City was throwing out their own memos, and within New York City you had different contacts and different procedures for Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, etc. So the essential and emergent cases, like I said, those opened up for virtual appearances around March 26th. They were just these cases. So orders of protection, which is interesting because it was really geared towards the petitioner, somebody wanting an order of protection. So what happens to the respondent who gets removed from their house because of allegations made by a petitioner, and then they don't get a chance to defend themselves? Because remember, you can just walk into family court, fill out a petition, see a judge, obtain an order of protection if you've met the prima facie case level, and then and get a temporary order of protection. So I think what was happening was that the courts were giving virtual court appearance dates for people to be able to appear on these petitions, but they may not have been as quick as what it would normally be. And then you've got a petitioner being able to get this order of protection and the respondent not really being able to, in a timely fashion, defend themselves. Child abuse, child neglect, and child protection cases, those never stopped. Those continued. Juvenile delinquency proceedings continued. You could bring an application for what's called pendente lite. I think I've discussed this in the past. So what that means is if there are issues during a divorce with respect to temporary child support, things not getting paid, you can bring a pendente lite application. It happens in a lot of divorce cases, but they have to be severe enough that it would be deemed essential. So it can't necessarily be, my husband didn't pay the cable bill this month. Okay, but if you are solely relying on your spouse's income to eat, you have children, you use a credit card and you don't have any other ability to spend money, and then the credit card was cut off, that would be dire enough to be able to get in front of a judge. Another thing that got in front of a judge that was deemed essential is the situations that I was talking about before. Is some people were withholding parental access to the other parent because they were an essential worker, or they were engaging in behavior that contradicted the stay-at-home mandate of the governor. So all of those questions could have been presented to the judge as an emergency, and they would have heard the case virtually and then made an order. Interestingly, any motions that you brought have to be approved by the clerk. So it was a process where you have to write the whole motion and then get it approved by a clerk, not even the judge or a law secretary, by a clerk first. If you don't reach that level, you're done. So now you've just put in all of this work, all of this energy into drafting an extensive motion, and then you get denied at the clerk's level. If you get beyond the clerk level, then it could still be denied. So the judge wanted you to write all of the whole motion and then say, this is not emergent enough, I'm not even going to hear it. In one of the webinars that I watched, the chief judge in Suffolk said that a majority of cases got past that level. At least were able to be heard orally on the record, so that they could present their case, and the drafting of the motion was not for naught. Very case-by-case analysis. That was made clear to us in the beginning. People tried to say, well, what about this? What about this? It's very fact-specific on whether or not an order would be granted for a particular situation. About 2 weeks later, we moved into non-essential priority cases. So the way it was described in the memorandum is cases in which conferences will help advance the case. I think it was very judge dependent. I'm still trying to get a conference on one of my cases that needs to move, but then on another case that was kind of tinkering, judge got right on it. So I think it's a part by part basis on whether or not these were deemed priority enough to get them back on the calendar. Once you're back on the calendar, you've got conferences virtually, and then they'll just set it, you're back on. So then they'll set another date for a virtual appearance. These types of issues had to do with, child custody or modification type proceedings, support issues that were not emergent enough to be in that category, but we need to have a conversation about it. That can get back on the calendar. Homeschooling issues like I was talking about before. People being furloughed or losing their job due to the pandemic and then wanting to modify their support numbers. That was another issue that happened, and that could be discussed at this juncture. About 2 weeks ago, well, less than that actually, a week to 10 days ago, they started allowing us to file requests for judicial intervention and getting preliminary conferences. That was not something that we were allowed to do before. Now we're able to do that and get cases that didn't have a judge assigned yet onto the judge's radar, and so we can start the case. Regular compliance conferences, like I said, I think it's more of a judge by judge, part by part basis. We can file uncontested divorce submission packets. Whether the judgment of divorce gets signed right now is a whole other story, but at least they can get filed and off of our desk and into the clerk's office. We were allowed to file new motions, but we have to request a conference. We can't just file a motion. You have to request a settlement conference before you get permission to file a motion. And then of course we could have settlement conferences in family court. If there's a settlement between parties, you put it all on the record always. There can't really, at least in Nassau, they won't so order a written agreement between the parties. The parties have to be what's called allocuted and put on the record. They were doing that virtually, which I found very impressive. Alternative dispute resolution. So that had to do with if the court appoints a neutral person to help assist the case move along, that was able to go again, and then appeals. Still to come. So like I said, commencing new matrimonial actions that just started on Monday, we're able to do that again, e-filing only. Signing of these orders, there's probably sitting there, and there's probably a huge backlog. So judgments of divorce, qualified domestic relations orders, if they have already been submitted, who knows when we're going to get them at this juncture. Before all of this, Nassau County has definitely improved the length of time between submitting the uncontested packet and signing the judgment of divorce. And who knows now, we're probably back to waiting 6 months for a judgment of divorce to be signed. Settlement conferences are happening between attorneys and clients. That's an interesting, maybe that'll happen in the future rather than trying to set up a 4 or 5-way conference. We do it via video. There's talk of in-person court conferences for attorneys only starting in mid-June. I have no idea how that's going to happen, but we will see. Privacy issues for e-filed documents. So in matrimonial land, you've got to produce things like social security numbers, kids' social security numbers, et cetera. You got to be careful because in the e-filing world, you're not supposed to do that. Is it going to change with matrimonial stuff? Is there going to be an exception? Are these cases going to be totally sealed, et cetera? So those things are still to be determined. Other things that are issues, retroactivity. So what happens is if you file a petition or you file for divorce, things can be retroactive from that filing date. So if we were unable to file, let's say, a downward modification for child support on April 15th, could I still prepare the petition, have the other person serve, and then argue that the retroactivity should be at least from the date of service and then just file it later. That's an issue that has not been determined yet. It's an argument that I have heard from various colleagues about making in front of a judge or a support magistrate, and maybe they will allow that. Because if you then can't file it until, let's say, June, that's 2 months worth of child support payments that could be downwardly modified if it's retroactive for the date of service. Unemployment. So if people are not employed or they didn't receive the additional unemployment insurance, what will the court look at if you're trying to get a reduction in child support or a change in maintenance? Normally, the court requires that the respondent, or I'm sorry, the petitioner who's seeking a downward modification, they have to show efforts that they have made to obtain commensurate employment. Okay, so how much are they going to look at the extent of your efforts when we're in the middle of a pandemic? Are you going to have to prove that you applied to X, Y, and Z jobs, or are you going to have, or is it not really going to hold as much weight? Or another thing I thought of is the court going to say, all right, well, why didn't you look for an essential job? I mean, food stores are still open and all those essential workers are still going to work. I'm sure they're looking for people. Even though that has nothing to do with the profession that you're in currently, why didn't you do something like that? It'll be interesting where the court goes on that. And it will also be interesting to see if these virtual court appearances are something that's going to happen for the long term. Is it going to be a positive thing or is it going to be a negative thing? I think positive, under the positive column there, it's certainly more cost effective for clients. I can sign on to a virtual appearance, have a conference call in 15 minutes rather than waiting an hour and a half to get called in. So, you only bill for the time that you're doing the conference. So it's definitely more cost effective for clients. Is it more efficient? I think so. So far, it's definitely been efficient. I don't know if once more cases are jumping onto the virtual world, whether or not it's going to be less efficient because you'll be in a waiting room for a while. I have no idea. The negative aspect, at least in my field, is that the clients aren't really accountable. They don't really feel it, right? They don't feel it in their pocket for a 15-minute conference, and they're not part of it. So they're not feeling much pressure to resolve or to hear from the judge, him or herself, about what the perspective is. So it seems like it's less apt to resolve cases and more apt to just kick things, at least things that are non-emergent. Another negative might be scheduling difficulties, because in normal, I could have 3 different appearances in a courtroom, or in various courtrooms in one building. And it's a lot easier for me to physically be there and go from court to court to court. If you're in the virtual land, I'm not sure how you even do that. Like, who do you contact? How are you appearing on more than one at a certain period of time? And so I assume that there will be much more scheduling conflicts amongst attorneys once this really gets more up and running. And then obviously I cannot imagine doing a hearing or a trial or dealing with the evidentiary issues virtually. I just really can't. So, I mean, I don't think that trials, at least maybe trials, would be in person. I do know that attorneys have conducted hearings virtually during the emergent phase. But I just can't imagine. I haven't done it yet, and I would prefer not to. So finally, will COVID surge cause a divorce surge? Just closing thoughts. Stress in general leads to divorce, right? I mean, people deal with chronic illnesses, loss of a child, deployment issues, work schedule conflicts, loss of a job. I mean, all of these are stress triggers that can lead to a dissolution of a marriage. What makes the pandemic so different than any other stress? Because we are locked in with each other. There is no escape. There's no ability to leave and cool off. There's no distractions. You are forced to either communicate it out or acknowledge that this isn't working. I was trying to do some research in other countries that were ahead of us in the pandemic. I found one article that in China, there was a sharp increase in divorce filings around February. Couldn't really find much in other countries, but I'd be curious to see how that pans out. We'll see. We'll see if it's going to be a surge of babies in 7 months or a surge of divorces. Time will tell, and we'll all get out of this, and we'll see where we're at. So that concludes. Any questions?